Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today, we are reading Chapter 16 of Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings, and as always, you should buy the book to support the original work. Chapter 16. The next day, Garion was too stiff and sore to even think about getting out of bed. A stream of visitors, however, kept him too occupied to think about his aches and pains. The visits from the Alorn kings in their splendid robes were particularly flattering, and each of them praised his courage. Then the queens came and made a great fuss over his injuries, offering warm sympathy and gentle stroking touches to his forehead. The combination of praise and sympathy and the certain knowledge that he was the absolute center of attention was overwhelming, and his heart was full. The last visitor of the day, however, was Mr. Wolf, who came when evening was creeping through the snowy streets of Val Alorn. The old man wore his usual tunic and cloak, and his hood was turned up as if he had been outside. "Have you seen my boar, Mr. Wolf?" Garion asked proudly. "An excellent animal," Wolf said, though without much enthusiasm. "But didn't anyone tell you it's customary to jump out of the way after the boar has been speared?" "I didn't really think about it," Garion admitted, "but wouldn't that have seemed, well, cowardly?" "Were you that concerned about what a pig might think of you?" "Well," Garion faltered, "not really, I guess." "You're developing an amazing lack of good sense for one so young," Wolf observed. "It normally takes years and years to reach the point you seem to have arrived at overnight." He turned to Aunt Paul, who sat nearby. "Polgara, are you quite certain that there's no hint of Arendish blood in our Garion's background? He has been behaving most Arendish lately. First he rides the great maelstrom like a rocking horse, and then he tries to break a wild boar's tusks with his ribs. Are you sure you didn't drop him on his head when he was a baby?" Aunt Paul smiled, but said nothing. "I hope you recover soon, boy," Wolf said, "and try to give some thought to what I've said." Garion sulked, mortally offended by Mr. Wolf's words. Tears welled up in his eyes, despite all his efforts to control them. "Thank you for stopping by, Father," Aunt Paul said. "It's always a pleasure to call on you, my daughter," Wolf said, and quietly left the room. "Why did he have to talk to me like that?" Garion burst out, wiping his nose. "Now he's gone and spoiled it all." "Spoiled what, dear?" Aunt Paul asked, smoothing the front of her gray dress. "All of it," Garion complained. "The kings all said I was very brave." "Kings say things like that," Aunt Paul said. "I wouldn't pay too much attention if I were you." "I was brave, wasn't I?" "I'm sure you were, dear," Aunt Paul said. "And I'm sure the pig was very impressed." "You're as bad as Mr. Wolf is," Garion accused. "Yes, dear," she said. "I suppose I probably am, but that's only natural. Now, what would you like for supper?" "I'm not hungry," Garion said defiantly. "Really? You probably need a tonic then. I'll fix you one." "I think I've changed my mind," Garion said quickly. "I rather thought you might," Aunt Paul said. And then, without explanations, she suddenly put her arms around him and held him close to her for a long time. "What am I going to do with you?" she said finally. "It's all right, Aunt Paul," he assured her. "This time, perhaps," she said, taking his face between her hands. "It's a splendid thing to be brave, my Garion, but try once in a while to think a little bit first. Promise me?" "All right, Aunt Paul," he said, a little embarrassed by all this. Oddly enough, she still acted as if she really cared about him. The idea that there could still be a bond between them, even if they were not related, began to dawn on him. It could never be the same, of course, but at least it was something. He began to feel a little better about the whole thing. The next day he was able to get up. His muscles still ached a bit, and his ribs were somewhat tender, but he was young and was healing fast. About mid-morning, he was sitting with Dernig in the great hall of Enheg's palace when the silvery-bearded Earl of Slean approached them. "King Furlick wonders if you would be so kind as to join us in the council chamber, good man Dernig," he said politely. "Me, your honor?" Dernig asked incredulously. His Majesty is most impressed with your sensibility, the old gentleman said. He feels that you represent the very best of Sandarian practicality. What we face involves all men, not just the kings of the West, and so it's only proper that good, solid common sense be represented in our proceedings. I'll come at once, Your Honor, Dernick said, getting up quickly, but you'll have to forgive me if I say very little. Garion waited expectantly. We've all heard of your adventure, my boy, the Earl of Selene said pleasantly to Garion. Ah, to be young again, he sighed. Coming, Dernick? Immediately, Your Honor, Dernick said, and the two of them made their way out of the great hall toward the council chamber. Garion sat alone, wounded to the quick by the exclusion. He was at an age where his self-esteem was very tender, and inwardly he writhed at the lack of regard implicit in his not being invited to join them. Hurt and offended, he sulkily left the great hall and went to visit the boar which hung in an ice-filled cooling room just off the kitchen. At least the boar had taken him seriously. One could, however, spend only so much time in the company of a dead pig without becoming depressed. The boar did not seem nearly so big as he had when he was alive and charging, and the tusks were impressive, but neither so long nor so sharp as Garion remembered them. Besides, it was cold in the cooling room, and sore muscles stiffened quickly in chilly places. There was no point in trying to visit Beric. The red-bearded man had locked himself in his chamber to brood in blackest melancholy, and refused to answer his door even to his wife, and so Garion left entirely on his own, moped about for a while, and decided he might as well explore this vast palace with its dusty, unused chambers and dark, twisting corridors. He walked for what seemed hours, opening doors and closing hallways that sometimes ended abruptly against blank stone walls. The palace of Enheg was enormous, having been, as Beric had explained, some 3,000 years and more in construction. One southern wing was so totally abandoned that its entire roof had fallen in centuries ago. Garion wandered there for a time in the second-floor corridors of the ruin, his mind filled with gloomy thoughts of mortality and transient glory as he looked into rooms where snow lay thickly on ancient beds, and stools and the tiny tracks of mice and squirrels run everywhere. And then he came to an unroofed corridor where there were other tracks, those of a man. The footprints were quite fresh, for there were no sign of snow in them, and it had snowed heavily the night before. At first he thought the tracks might be his own, and that he had somehow circled and come back to a corridor he had already explored, but the footprints were much larger than his. There were a dozen possible explanations, of course, but Garion felt his breath quicken. The man in the green cloak was still lurking about the palace. Astorak the Murgo was somewhere in Val Alorn, and the flaxen-haired nobleman was hiding somewhere in the forest with obviously unfriendly intentions. Garion realized that the situation might be dangerous, and that he was unarmed except for his small dagger. He retraced his steps quickly to a snowy chamber he had just explored, and took down a rusty sword from a peg where it had hung forgotten for uncountable years. Then, feeling a bit more secure, he returned to follow the silent tracks. So long as the path of the unknown intruder lay in that roofless and long-abandoned corridor, following him was simplicity itself. The undisturbed snow made tracking easy, but once the trail led over a heap of fallen debris and into the gaping blackness of a dusty corridor where the roof was still intact, things became a bit more difficult. The dust on the floor helped, but it was necessary to do a great deal of stooping and bending over. Garion's ribs and legs were still sore, and he winced and grunted each time he had to brace down to examine the stone floor. In a very short while, he was sweating and gritted his teeth, and thinking about giving the whole thing up, and he heard a faint sound far down the corridor ahead. He shrank back against the wall, hoping that no light from behind him would filter dimly through to allow him to be seen. Far ahead, a figure passed stealthily through the pale light from a single tiny window. Garion caught a momentary flicker of green, and knew finally whom he was following. He kept close to the wall, and moved with cat-like silence in his soft leather shoes, the rusty sword gripped tightly in his hand. If it had not been for the startling nearness of the voice of the Earl of Selene, however, he would probably have walked directly into the man he had been following. Is it at all possible, noble Belgarath, that our enemy can be awakened before all the conditions of the ancient prophecy are met? The Earl was asking. Garion stopped. Directly ahead of him, in a narrow embrasure in the wall of the corridor, he caught sight of a slight movement. The green-cloaked man lurked there, listening in the dimness to the words that seemed to come from somewhere beneath. Garion shrank back against the wall, scarcely daring to breathe. Carefully, he stepped backward until he found another embrasure and drew himself into the concealing darkness. A most appropriate question, Belgarath, the quiet voice of Chohag of the Algars said. Can this apostate use the power now in his hands to revive the Accursed One? The power's there, the familiar voice of Mr. Wolf said, but he might be afraid to use it. If it isn't done properly, the power will destroy him. He won't rush into such an act, and if it's that hesitation that gives us little bit of time we have. Then Silk spoke. Didn't you say that he might want the thing for himself? Maybe he plans to leave his master in an undisturbed slumber and use the power he's stolen to raise himself as king in the lands of the Angarax. King Rodar of Drasnia chuckled. Somehow I don't see the Grollam priesthood so easily relinquishing their power in the lands of Angarak and bowing down to an outsider. The high priest of the Grollams is no mean sorcerer himself, I'm told. Forgive me, Rodar, King Enheg said, but if the power's in the thief's hands, the Grollams won't have any choice but to accept his dominion. I've studied the power of this thing, and if even half of what I've read is true, he can use it to rip down Rak Cathal as easily as you'd kick apart an anthill. Then if they still resist, he could depopulate all of Cathal Murgos from Rak Gaska to the Talnidran border. No matter what, however, whether it's the apostate or the accursed one who eventually rises that power, the Angarax will follow, and they'll come west. Shouldn't we inform the Arens and the Talnidrans, and the Ulgos as well about what's happened then? Brand the Riven Warder asked. Let's not be taken by surprise again. I wouldn't be in too much hurry to rouse our southern neighbors, Mr. Wolf said. When Paul and I leave here, we'll be moving south. If Erendia and Talnidra are mobilized for war, the general turmoil would only hinder us. The Emperor's legions are soldiers. They can respond quickly when the need arises, and the Arens are always ready for war. The whole kingdom hovers on the brink of general warfare all the time. It's premature, Aunt Paul's familiar voice agreed. Armies would just get in the way of what we're trying to do. If we can apprehend my father's old pupil and return the thing he pilfered to Riva, the crisis will pass. Let's not stir up the Southerners for nothing. She's right, Wolf said. There's always a risk in mobilization. A king with an army on his hands usually starts to think of mischief. I'll advise the king of the Arens at Vomimber and the emperor of Tal Haleth of as much as they need to know as I pass through. But we should get word through to the word through to the Gorum of Ulgo. Chohag, do you think you could get a messenger through to Prolgu at this time of the year? It's hard to say, Ancient One, Chohag said. The passes into those mountains are difficult in the winter. I'll try, though. Good, Wolf said. Beyond that, there's not much more we can do. For the time being, it might not be a bad idea to keep this matter in the family, so to speak. If worst comes to worst, and the Angarax invade again, Aloria at least will be armed and ready. There'll be time for Erendia and the Empire to make their preparations. King Furlik spoke then in a troubled voice. It's easy for the Alorn kings to talk of war, he said. Alorns are warriors, but my Sindaria is a peaceful kingdom. We don't have castles or fortified keeps, and my people are farmers and tradesmen. Kal Torak made a mistake when he chose the battlefield of Vomimber, and it's not likely that the Angarax will make the same mistake again. I think they'll strike directly across the grasslands of northern Algaria and fall upon Sindaria. We have a lot of food and very few soldiers. Our country would provide an ideal base for a campaign in the west, and I'm afraid that we'd fall quite easily. Then, to Garion's amazement, Durnik spoke. "Don't cheapen the men of Sandaria so, Lord King," he said in a firm voice. "I know my neighbors, and they'll fight. We don't know very much about swords and lances, but we'll fight. If Angarax come to Sandaria, they won't find the taking as easy as some might imagine. And if we put torches to the fields and the storehouses, there won't be all that much food for them to eat." There was a long silence, and then Furlax spoke again in a voice strangely humble. "Your words shame me, good man Dernick," he said. "Maybe I've been a king for so long I've forgotten what it means to be a Sendar. One remembers that there are only a few passes leading through the western escarpment into Sandaria," Hedder, son of King Chohag, said quietly. "A few avalanches in the right places could make Sandaria inaccessible as the moon. If the avalanches took place in the right times, whole armies of Angarax might find themselves trapped in those narrow corridors." "Now that's an entertaining thought," Silk chuckled. "Then we could let Dernick put his incendiary impulses to a better use than burning turnip patches. Since Torak One-Eyes seems to enjoy the smell of burning sacrifices so much, we might be able to accommodate him." Far down the dusty passage in which he was hiding, Garion caught the sudden flicker of a torch and heard the faint jingling of several male shirts. He almost failed to recognize the danger until the last instant. The man in the green cloak also heard the sounds and saw the light of the torch. He stepped from his hiding place and fled back the way he had come, directly past the embrasure where Garion had concealed himself. Garion shrank back, clutching his rusty sword. But as luck had it, the man was looking back over his shoulder at the twinkling torch as he ran by on soft feet. As soon as he had passed, Garion also slipped out of his hiding place and fled. The Cherik warriors were looking for intruders, and it might be difficult to explain what he was doing in the dark hallway. He briefly considered following the spy again, but decided that he'd had enough of that for one day. It was time to tell someone about the things he'd seen. Someone had to be told, someone to whom the kings would listen. Once he reached the more frequented corridors of the palace, he firmly began to make his way towards the chamber where Beric brooded in silent melancholy.